mind.
Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of What's Going On. I'm your host, Tom D'Ambra. As always, folks, we're very thankful you take the time from your busy day to view our program. I was reading a lot about George Washington, which he's one of my favorites in American history. And last night I was reading very late about him, once again, and I decided that instead of just telling you and demonstrating to you once again about all the corruption in the government, about the facade money system or lack of money system, as I say, that we are a co-surety to, how instead of talking about how our courts are controlled by a foreign guild called the British Accreditation Registry, instead of talking about all the poisons that the asymmetrical warfare that they level against us with the fluorides, the chemtrails, the vaccines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I thought I would talk about the man whose birthday we just recently celebrated. But yet, when you even think about this, now it's known as President's Day, not Washington's birthday. And the reason why they've done this, my friends, is, again, this is about social engineering through the demographics of language. And what I mean by that is the average student today, even at junior high school level, they may have heard of George Washington. They have no understanding what the man was about, the history he lived, the importance of he was to the forming of our nation, nor the personal, deep and horrific and economic sacrifices he made to the cause of liberty. And he was not only a great soldier, a tremendous leader, he was a man of impeccable honor. When his commanders got together to format plans, half the time, more than half the time, excuse me, most of the time, they were in retreat, and at some points, a very hasty retreat. So emotions were high, and there's one thing that Washington did not allow, and even at this simple thing, and imagine this among soldiers, he wouldn't allow foul language. He believed in the basic character of a good, honorable man, and he thought that whatever we portrayed out of our mouths, it wasn't just our actions or our inactions, as it is with the American people today, but what is portrayed out of our mouths represents very much who we are and what we stand for. So I sort of pulled a quick one on Stanley and Bill this morning and calling them and saying, hey guys, scrap the whole show that we had planned because we just celebrated Washington's birthday and we're going to talk about the man. And we're going to try to put together some of his life, some of his sacrifice, but more importantly, we're going to get into the foundations of the man and we're going to get into his accomplishments, not just in the military field. So before we get into this, I have two things I do want to cover from the program we had planned for you. And one of them is that, now we've been talking to you about how, for a long time, that the powers to be, if you would, particularly the bankers, through the use of corporatism, which is, as El Duce Mussolini said, fascism, which is absolutely what we are under currently. But that we said to you that, you know, they're watching you through a TV, they're monitoring you through your computer, they're monitoring you through the RFID chips and all the, everything from appliances to what we buy, everything. Never mind just financial transactions. But now what's taken place in a big, see, this is great for you that we are watching you in your homes. We're going to play a short clip from you of ESPN actually announcing to you in a joyous way that, hey, look how wonderful it is that we are watching you and your family in your home literally through your television screen.
This guy is a perfect example of the Conference of Champions. His hometown, northwest of Belgrade, the capital. 350,000 people right there on the Danube River. And tonight, their family, his family, is watching in the living room at home. And one of the great new technologies that we have here at ESPN is that we can look at you in your house through your TV. So, hi, everybody. It's 6 in the morning.
Isn't that fascinating? Doesn't that make you feel all good? Now, if you knew about the Fourth Amendment, if it was taught in the public school system, you'd be very upset about that. Fortunately, I do not watch TV per se, so and I just refuse to participate in the demise of my nation in any way that I can, and that's one way that I do. Now, some people will say, well, I have nothing to hide, so all is good. Don't worry about a thing. Folks, the other thing I was going to talk to you about is that we found a clip, and Bill was able to gather it, about Alan Greenspan, publicly, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board at the time, publicly talking about the position, the superior position of the Federal Reserve private for-profit bank as to the standing of the United States government. It's one thing that we've been coming up here for years, 300 plus shows telling you about this, showing it in historical data, all the studies. I'm digressing already too much, but I just want you to watch this short clip from the words of, at that time, the acting chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and let you know what your standing is.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter. And I've had very good relationships with presidents.
I'll bet you that makes you feel all warm and fuzzy also, doesn't it? So not only are the technocrats watching you and recording you in your home, now because the Federal Reserve, because this isn't taught in school, is letting you know publicly on television exactly what your standings are to the private, for-profit banking corporation that controls you, your property, your children, your lack of money system, that put you as a co-surety to a facade debt. So is this what the sacrifices of men like George Washington and millions of others and families have made for? So that private bankers can rule us and control us and tax us and fee us? Because after all, the power to tax is the power to destroy. So what would a person like George Washington think of our current situation today? Would George Washington be upset by the private bankers, by all of the greed that they represent, by the technocrats who and the corporations that work with them to dominate us? No. He wouldn't be upset with them. He understands the depravity of man. The man studied it at length. What he would be upset with, however, is you and I, for allowing this to happen because of the sacrifices made by so many. Folks, understand that Washington was trying to put as they were called many times, Scrabble, ragtag Scrabble, together as a military force for an ideal that had never happened in the history of government or mankind before, and that is self-governance. It's never happened before. It was a pipe dream, if you would, to use a modern terminology. So not only did he have to manifest the belief that this can happen, that this is God's divine providence, that this does happen, and he had to portray this in all of his actions, in his language, in his character, in his morality, in his leadership. But he did this under some of the most dire circumstances that any military force has ever put up with in the history of man. A brilliant leader he was. Was he the best field general? To use a football analogy, the X and O's of the game? Absolutely not. My personal opinion, I would say Benedict Arnold, by far, was the best field general. Look at the Battle of Saratoga, and I'm not going to do that too much, but was he the best field general? Probably not. But what made the man so successful in such dire straits? Under an ideal that had never happened before in the history of man. Let's try to get to understand this man real briefly. I have a copy of Washington's farewell address. And I could just sit here and read this 32 pages to you verbatim, which I'm going to get into some of that a little bit. But what I want to get into is try to break down some of the things about George Washington that you may have not known. For instance, what were the professions of George Washington? George Washington began his working life when Leonard Fairfax asked him to accompany him on a surveying trip. Stop right there. Washington was a surveyor at 14 years old. 14. Washington was then 16 years old, and on this trip he gained valuable skills in surveying and cartography. He continued to work as a surveyor for the next 2 years. In between surveying trips to different areas of Virginia, George Washington continued to live with his half-brother Lawrence Washington, who would teach him skills he would need as a soldier in the military. In 1752, Lawrence Washington, his older brother, died. Folks, he died from tuberculosis. And George became a plantation owner and farmer. Despite the relatively small amount of time he was able to spend working as a farmer, Washington enjoyed his life as a gentleman farmer. That's how he saw himself. Overseeing farm operations and the recreation of beautiful landscaping. He believed that it was the most noblest of all professions. I have read books upon books about Washington, and I'm going to tell you, folks, Washington did. I like the way this author described this. He considered farming the most noblest of all professions. The next job that Washington took on was that of a soldier. The governor of the colony of Virginia appointed Washington as a major and sent him on a mission to the Ohio River Valley. Now, the reason why Washington was granted this, not just for his leadership and his skills and all, but this is the area where Washington had gone out and done his surveying work. Washington fought in the first battle and many of the subsequent battles of the French and Indian War. Now, for those of you in Vermont here and throughout northern New York State and Vermont and New Hampshire and so forth, and even into down to Massachusetts, the French and Indian War was known in North America as the French and Indian War. Historically, it was known as the 7-Year War. A few years into the war, Washington was promoted to colonel and continued to serve as a soldier in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. When the French and English finally came to an agreement and the war was over, Washington returned home to work as a farmer once again in 1759. Beginning in 1765, Washington served as a member of the House of Burgess of Virginia. With the other colonists, Washington also became angry about the high taxes England was imposing on the colonies without any kind of representation in their government and joined in the protest. In 1774, Washington served as a member of the First Continental Congress, the colonies' first attempt at their own government. The next year, Washington returned to serve on the Second Continental Congress. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress unanimously chose George Washington as the commander-in-chief, the general of all of the armies and militias in the colonies. The armies, folks, they were known as the regulars or the bluecoats. The militias, because we were not supposed to have a standing army, the militias was every able-bodied male from 16 to 60. And there was quotas that had to be made. We were not supposed to have a standing army, and we've got into that before. Okay. He worked as hard as a general and demanded the same from the men he commanded. Washington was a smart leader and did not let the British draw him into battles, but instead chose the battles that he would fight himself. During the war, Washington led 10,000 men and stayed with them for almost the entire war. When the war was over in 1783, Washington resigned from his commission as the commander-in-chief of the new country's army. He once again returned to Mount Vernon, where he had hoped to live the remainder of his life as a gentleman farmer. However, when the Continental Convention met in 1787, Washington was chosen as one of Virginia's delegates. Now, Washington didn't want to do this. He had had enough. But he felt his duty to do this. George Washington was chosen to be the president of the Constitutional Convention. For 3 long, hot months, from late May to mid-September, the members met in closed rooms. Finally, when they came to an agreement and the members signed the Constitution on September 17, 1787, once the Constitution was ratified, the people elected George Washington as their first president. After serving 2 consecutive terms, Washington was finally able to return home in 1798. He lived there for 3 years, working as a noble farmer. And my friends, unfortunately, Mr. Washington passed away and had a very short time of 3 years of enjoyment, what he wanted to do all his life. He dedicated his entire life to duty, honor, and country. Let us continue. And I want to go back to the French and Indian War because I wish to show you that God does partake in the affairs of man, even to today. I know many don't believe that. Many don't believe there's a God. If you were taught up in the public fool system, you believe we were one-celled Amiga, which eventually came to land, and then eventually grew into a monkey, and then eventually grew into human beings. You know, I've often wondered, if that was true, why do we still have monkeys? Let me continue, not to digress. Okay, this is Washington and the French and Indian War. For years, French soldiers had been making their way down the Ohio River from Canada, building forts and making allies among the Native Americans. Between the French and the Indians, the English backwoodsmen and settlers were being pushed back towards the larger settlements. In 1753, the governor selected Major Washington for a mission to deliver a message to the French commander. Washington was to return with an answer from the French commander with a report of the situation, such as the location of forts and the strength of the French armies. The letter asked the French to leave the settlers of Virginia in peace. Taking only a few men, Washington set off into the wilderness on October 3rd, 1753. On his way, Washington met an Indian chieftain named Half King, and they became friends. Along with some of his friends, Half King led Washington and his men to a French fortress on some of their hidden pass. During his journey, Washington had faced many dangers, including hostile natives and almost drowning in an icy river. On January 16, 1754, Washington returned to Governor Dinwiddie the important reply and a very thorough report which included a map of the areas over which Washington had traveled. When he returned, Washington was promoted to lieutenant colonel. The reply from the French was not good news. The French wanted to take part of Virginia. The governor gave Lieutenant Colonel Washington command over several hundred soldiers and sent him back to keep the French out of the colony. Washington fought the French and the Indians for 4 years. 4 years, folks. During the 4 years, Washington distinguished himself as a soldier, an officer, and a leader. Washington fought in the first battle of the French and Indian War. In the summer of 1754, the governor of Virginia sent 21-year-old Major Washington, 21 years old, to the region near Fort Duquesne with another message. This time the message was for the French to leave. The French refused, and Washington returned with a small militia. Washington met with defeat and built a fort a few miles away. The fort, Fort Necessity, was not only completed and did not have enough supplies when it was attacked by the French on July 3rd. Major Washington's men were cold and hungry and not able to fight very well. By the end of the day, a third of the Virginians were killed or wounded. In one day, Washington was forced to surrender. One of the greatest advantages the French had over the English soldiers was the way they fought. The English soldiers wore bright red coats and marched in straight lines through the wilderness. The French and the Indians, however, fought guerrilla style, hiding behind trees and bushes and such, never coming into the open. Although Washington advised his superiors that they should stop wearing the red coats and hide behind trees as their enemies were doing, the English commanders refused to listen. Can you say Colonel Rogers Rangers? In 1755, England sent Major General Edward Braddock along with 2,000 British regulars to help the British colonial forces. Washington was put under the command of General Braddock, and together they marched back toward Fort Duquesne, where Washington had lost the first battle of the war. When they started their march, Washington advised General Braddock that they should leave behind the heavy equipment, such as the cannons, etc., so that they could travel faster. Braddock disagreed and thought the British army would need the firepower to defeat the enemy. Colonel Washington was proven right, however, when the slow-moving British army, led by Braddock, were ambushed. A battle ensued, and Braddock was wounded, leaving Washington the commanding officer. As an officer, Washington was targeted by the Indians and the French and was fired on repeatedly. After having 2 horses shot out from underneath him, Washington chose to command the army from the ground. It soon became obvious that the English could not win the battle, and Washington led the remaining men in a retreat. He brought the wounded Braddock back to Monongahela, where Braddock died 4 days after the battle. After the battle, Washington found that there were 4 separate bullet holes in his clothes, yet not one of them had touched him. Let me read that again. After the battle, Washington found that there were 4 separate bullet holes in his clothes, yet not one of them had touched him. That jacket, all the 4 bullet holes were in his blouse. It's known in the military. We call them jackets in the civilian world. 4 separate bullet holes. Folks, they didn't have Kevlar body armor in 1759. That jacket, my friends, is on display today at the Smithsonian Institute. This isn't makeup. This is real. This is God's province. This is men making sacrifices in the faith of God's province. After the battle, George Washington wrote a letter to his brother Jack where he explained, "By all the powerful dispensation of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my jacket, and 2 horses shot out under me and escaped unhurt. Although death was leveling my companions on every side of me, I was unscathed." Because of his bravery and level-headed command of the English forces during the battle, the governor promoted Washington to colonel. 15 years after the Battle of Monongahela, Washington met the native chief that had commanded the Indians at the battle. The chief had commanded that Washington be shot and had observed that he was never hurt. Washington was exploring the wilderness with a friend and found a group of Indians and the chief who were searching for Washington because the chief wanted to talk to him. Through an interpreter, the chief spoke these words to George Washington. I am a chief and ruler over my tribes. My influence extends to the waters of the Great Lakes and to the far blue mountains. I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see this young warrior of the great battle. It was on that day when the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forest that I had first beheld this chief. I called to my young men and said, Mark yon tall and daring warrior. He is not of the redcoat tribe. He hath an Indian's wisdom, and his warriors fight as we do. Guerrilla warfare. Himself alone is exposed while he was in commanding the retreat. Quick, let your aim be certain, and he dies. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for him, knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power mightier than we shield him from harm. Let me read that again. A power mightier than we shield him from harm. He cannot die in battle. I am an old and soon shall be gathered to the great council fire of my fathers in the land of the shades, where'er I go. But there is something that bid me to speak in the voice of prophecy. Listen, the Great Spirit protects this man and guides his destinies, that he will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty nation. I don't even need to comment on that, do I? What we're going to get into later, my friends, is we're going to get into, before George Washington, not this week because I'm running out of time, what happened to George Washington, God's providence, when, and before I should say, Washington made the unbelievable move of attacking the Haitians in Trenton, New Jersey. Let us get to some quotes of Mr. Washington if we could. A free people ought not only to be armed and disciplined, but they should have sufficient arms and ammunition to maintain a status of independence from any who might attempt to abuse them, which would include their own government. Who's trying to take your guns away, my friends? People who are trying to abuse you, people who do abuse us, in and out of the government. Please notice I didn't say our government. This is not our government. And we've got into that many, many times. This quote sums up Washington's feelings on your status of being able to not only defend yourself, but listen, maintain a status of independence from who might attempt to abuse them. There are states, my friends, where if someone breaks into your house and you and your family are there, and they come in the front door and you're able to get out the back door, you'll be arrested for stopping them from taking your stuff, which will then become their booty, out the front door. Because you're supposed to run out the back door. Let us continue. If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep to the slaughter. What are they trying to do with the internet? What did Hitler do and many regimes, authoritarian regimes, do with books? Why was it the Catholic Church didn't allow their people to read for 800 years? Because they wanted to keep them dumb and silent. Why is it we have the right, our rights are unalienable? Why is it the founding fathers told the federal government and all the governments about, yes, we have free speech. Our rights come from God, my friends. But if you don't believe in God, then you have nothing but civil rights, which come from government, which are not rights at all because they can be altered or taken away. They are merely benefits. Government is not reason. It is not eloquence. It is force, like fire. A troublesome servant and a fearful master. Never for a moment should it be left to irresponsible action. I could sit here for the next 3 months and do a discourse on irresponsible action of the government. And it's because the government is not answering to the people anymore, is it? The government answers to the creditors, the private, for-profit banking corporation, Federal Reserve, that their chairman just plainly and publicly stated to you they have an independent and superior position to the government. To contract new debts is not the way to pay old ones. Can you say, raise the debt ceiling? But what did Barry Soetoro, you know him as Obama, what did President Barack, which means lightning, Obama, say to the American people? Raising the debt ceiling doesn't raise the debt. Remember that? Raising the debt ceiling doesn't raise the debt. Something like Nancy Pelosi last week saying, when illegal immigrants do something illegal, excuse me? When illegal immigrants do something illegal, I didn't even listen to the rest of the conversation, the rest of her statement. If someone is an illegal immigrant, folks, aren't they doing something illegal because they're here illegally? To contract new debts is not the way to pay old ones. And what are the debt on our books now is almost 21 trillion. We just covered it last week. Another 1.2 trillion in the budget, no problem. The bankers will give the Treasury permission to print that. After all, you're the co-surety to it. Shouldn't be a problem. They don't have to pay the bill. You do. You do. We do. We don't own anything. Our labors are theirs. Here is what our money's supposed to be backed by. An intrinsic value known as gold and or silver. And we've read the Coinage Acts to you folks. What would you rather have? Take a look at that picture. Thank you, Bill. What would you rather have in your pocket, my friends? Would you rather have them gold nuggets and that gold bar? Or would you rather have a piece of paper that represents the debt that you are the co-surety to? What would you rather have? What do you think you could buy more with if we had a true intrinsic money value? What do you think the inflation rate would be if we had maintained? Because I can tell the gold, because I'll tell you right now, folks, and I've done this many times, right? The dollar, which was backed by gold, 25.8 grains of gold, 51 ratio of silver. If you went back to December 23rd, 1913, when the Federal Reserve, private foreign bank for profit, took over the money system of this country, it had 100% value, and it had maintained that 100% value. Now it represents 2% of the value of what it held 105 years ago. Or 104 years ago and 3 months. 98% of its purchasing power has been vanquished because it is not backed by an intrinsic valued commodity. That's why the gold standard is so important. And the more of these worthless, irredeemable, as Louis T. McFadden warned the American people, irredeemable paper, it's what we have. Washington's warnings are fantastic. Let's read some other quick quotes from our good friend, Mr. George Washington. And I'll be quick. Worry is the interest paid by those who borrow. Worry is the interest paid by those who borrow. Observe good faith and justice towards all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. In other words, provide honorable communications and contracts and commerce. Cultivate peace with them, not warfare. Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder. You want to go the other side of that? The old saying, I think it was Cicero that said, all men can be bought. My first wish to see this plague of mankind, which is war, to be banished from the earth. What do we do as a nation, as their government? What are we? We're in 143 countries now and actively in war in 6. Responsible for the murders of millions and millions of people, destruction of nations, all for the profits of the bankers because of the debt, all for the profits of the people who create the mechanisms of warfare, and all of the bloodshed of our genealogy and future children, and the debt that's laden upon us for the profits of these bankers and corporations at the cost of the poor of one nation, killing the poor of another nation. Reason, too late perhaps, may convince you of the folly of misspending time. Washington was and he got this lesson from his brother Lawrence. His brother Lawrence, one of the precious gifts that Lawrence, I told you I've done a lot of reading on Washington. One of the most precious gifts that Lawrence ever gave George Washington, particularly when he was dying, was a watch, a pocket watch. And Washington kept it with him always. And that watch represented the whole thing of the importance of time. Because we never know how much time we have in our life to accomplish whatever it is we deem we wish to accomplish, whether it be spiritual, materialistic, whatever. You know, we do not know how much time we have. Make positive use of our time is what Washington is saying, and efficiently. If to please the people we offer that we ourselves disprove, how can we afterward defend our work? Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can make repair in. What he's talking about, my friends, is what you do, how you act, how you speak. All your actions are all reflected in this. This all makes up the character of an individual. And when he says about the repair, let the honorable and the wise be able to make repair in it. In other words, if they have gone off, not done something honorable, that they can mimic your actions. You can be a mentor to them through an outstanding character. I'm running out of time, my friends. I'm going to just skip down here. 99% of the failures come from people who have the habit of making excuses. True. We should not look back unless it is to derive useful lessons from past errors and for the purpose of profiting by dearly bought experience. It is better to be alone than in bad company. I totally agree with that. You know the old saying, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree? If freedom of speech is taken away, and I knew we read this one earlier, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. It is well that I die hard, but I am not afraid to go. Why? Because this man had faith. I want to do one more, folks. Associate yourself with men of good quality. If you esteem your own reputation, it is better to be alone than in bad company. Now listen to this, all you homeschoolers. Understand what you mean to your children's education. All I am I owe to my mother. I attribute all my success in life to the moral, intellectual, spiritual, and physical education that I received from her. Let me ask you, in the public school system, are you going to learn moral, intellectual, spiritual education? The only physical education they're going to teach you is your fifth grader to confuse the gender of that child. And also, in some school systems, as we reported to you, how to masturbate in fifth grade. That's the only physical education they're going to get, my friends. And they're certainly not going to get moral, intellectual, or spiritual education in the public school system. Okay. Let me continue here. One other thing I'd like to get into with you, with Mr. Washington. Firearms are second only to the Constitution in importance. They are the people's liberty teeth. Let me ask you a question. Can you name one society, one tribe, one nation, one culture, one religion of people throughout the history of man who have ever benefited themselves from being disarmed and not inevitably be conquered? I want you to name one. You know what? There's a lot of history there, isn't there? You can't name one. You know why? It hasn't happened yet. Maybe someday man can elevate themselves, but until, spiritually and morally, but until the depravity of man is released from man's soul and we are no longer a fallen world, you must always question they that wish to take your primary way of defending you and your family. Washington's religion and moral beliefs. George Washington is often commended as a man of character. He had a sterling reputation for his integrity, honor, and his dedication to his country. After he died, many stories were told to demonstrate his character, even as a child. The famous story about George Washington and the cherry tree, for example, was most likely invented by the biographer Mason Locke Weems. Now, I agree with that. That cherry tree incident didn't take place. It was a parable. It was a parable. Although the story is fictitious, and we do not know whether or not George was always as honest as a child, the story demonstrates the honesty and character that people have encountered Washington later in life observed. And yes, my friends, he was this way as a child. George's mother had as much to do with his sense of morality and his religious beliefs, as we just attributed to in his statement. Mary Bell Washington spent the evenings reading the Bible to her children and spent time teaching George and her siblings the differences between right and wrong and morality. And what book did she choose to do this with? The one that was taken out of the public school system as soon as the federal government took over the school system. The Bible. What's happened to our society, our level of morality, our level of depravity, since the Bible and all its instructions were taken out of the education system? Because it's not education, folks. Now it's indoctrination. Think about our society from 1958, when I was born, to 2018. The Bible. Washington created success to his mother. And I just got done telling you that whole statement. I'm not going to read it again to you. But I just want to continue with this. While leading the American Army during the Revolutionary War, Washington demanded that his men act with integrity, morality, and honesty. He wanted his men to be more than good soldiers and stated, "While we are zealously performing the duties of good citizens and soldiers, we certainly ought not to be inattentive to the higher duties of religion, to the distinguished character of a patriot. It should be our highest glory to add the more distinguished character of a Christian." During the course of the war, Washington's character helped sustain his troops. General Washington also hoped and trusted that, this is his quote, "that every officer and man will endeavor to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier, defending the dearest rights and liberties of his country and countrymen." After the American colonies gained their independence from England, Washington realized that it was God that had granted our freedom and did not want anyone to forget or deny that the hand of God had guided his steps. George Washington declared, "I am sure that never was a people who had more reason to acknowledge a divine interposition in their affairs than those of these United States." And by the way, folks, the U is small. It is an adjective describing the states are united. "And I have shown to be pained to believe that they have forgotten that agency, which was so often manifested during our revolution, or that they fail to consider the omnipotence of that God who is alone able to protect them." Contrary to other victorious generals before him, Washington did not ask for or expect to be any kind of political or financial reward for his service. Instead, he led his army out of a sense of duty. Washington's moral character was more likely a contributing factor in his election as being first president of the new country. Washington believed that the government should depend on God and seek his will, and realized that mankind, when left to themselves, are unfit for their own government. Totally agree. Perhaps the greatest evidence of Washington's character was his resignation as commander-in-chief of the American Army, and later his refusal to serve a third term as president. In both of these cases, he relinquished all of his power, something that was unprecedented and is today. Washington realized that if any one man took too much power, the Americans would easily lose the freedom that they had just gained. My friends, I totally agree with that. I want to read one more statement to you from George Washington. "It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and to humbly implore his protection and favor." My friends, I totally agree with that. I obviously have run out of time to start to read Mr. George Washington's farewell address to you. Very, very important, my friends. You can get it online. I got this from the Congressional Record. If you're looking for it, it's Senate document number 106-21. Boy, that's an early document. 106-21. And you can get that from the Congressional Record. I am going to continue next week with George Washington. I think it's very, very important that we have an understanding of this man. A true warrior, a true soldier, but more importantly, my friends, his character his intelligence, the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, and even more, what he demanded of his soldiers, what they represented. It lifted them all. It lifted them all. That we're above the enemy. We're above them. We will not act like them. We will give quarter. We will speak like gentlemen. We will act like gentlemen. We will manifest kindness. That is what carried the day, my friends. Yes, the French had something to do with it, no doubt about it, militarily. But when Louis IV decided to go forward, that was big. But what carried the day was a divine providence of God. And our country has completely gone opposite on that. The foundations, we're taught that there's supposed to be separation of church and state. Where is that in the founding documents? I don't see it. Okay, my friends, I'd like to close with, I won't say unfortunate. The man lived to be 99 years old and of good health until his dying day. Billy Graham has gone on to meet his Creator in the realm that he desired all his life. And if you wish to talk about a man led by, again, by God, a man who literally, his character is what carried the day with Billy Graham. Was he the greatest orator of his day? No. Was he the richest? By far not. He maintained quite a poor lifestyle, Billy Graham, believe it or not. Did he have a magnificent, benevolent heart and do a tremendous amount of work for many throughout the world through different organizations and charities? Absolutely. Did he raise the most money for all them charities of anyone in his day? No, he did not. But what he did do is he amplified himself through all of the characters that Washington spoke of to his soldiers. That's what he did. And every move he made, he prayed on and he sought the will of God. He carried the will of God through all of his works to the best of his ability and the best of his understanding. And what we have to understand about this man, not just his virtue, his spirituality, his love of God, his love of his fellow man, we have to understand that this man exemplified what a Christian soldier is in the modern era today. He did all the things, folks. He was a soldier, he was faithful, he was honorable, he was honest, he was moral, he was benevolent, he was a fighter, he was a warrior, he was a tactician. And he gave of his will, he gave of his body, and he gave of his spirit, all in accomplishing what he thought was the will of God. So, Mr. Graham, I applaud you for 99 years of service in a country, to God, in a country that did all it could to keep God out of our culture. And it's because of you, we are seeing now the gain of culture in Christianity because of the work of this man being in the trenches for a lifetime. My friends, we are very thankful you take the time from your busy day to watch our program. We always close in asking you to seek truth, to obtain knowledge, and always to manifest kindness. We always close, though, in reminding you that your government is your responsibility, and we thank you for watching.
Can't believe we are all so blind. I can't believe we are all so blind. Well, the truth is very simple, very hard to find.